3 days before their wedding, a couple's romantic Christmas hike turns into a desperate fight for survival. When a sudden blizzard erases their path, they find themselves lost, freezing, with no way to call for help. Just as all hope begins to fade, a dark figure emerges from the swirling snow, something scientists said was nearly impossible to find: a melanistic bobcat. Only 12 had ever been documented in all of North America, and just one in Canada decades ago. The creature halts, looks back, and steps forward, as if asking them to follow. Then it begins to walk, leading them deeper into the storm. Where is it taking them? And what will be waiting when the tracks stop? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. It was Christmas Day in the late afternoon, 3 days before the wedding that had consumed Maya's family calendar for months. The little rental cabin they had booked at the edge of New Brunswick's wilderness looked like a scene straight from an old postcard. Gray, weathered logs, a tin roof with icicles hanging like glassy fangs and smoke curling lazily from its chimney. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, chasing away the biting cold that seeped through hand-hewn walls. Outside, snow fell in soft spirals, dusting spruce and birch trunks and muffling the world as if a blanket were being laid across the land. Connor sat on the front porch wrapped in a wool blanket, a printed scientific paper spread across his lap. He rubbed his hands together and blew on them, the breath clouding before being stolen by the wind. "According to this," he said to no one in particular, the excitement lighting his hazel eyes as he scanned the paper. "Only one melanistic bobcat has ever been recorded in Canada, in 1983. All the others were in Florida. This says there have been only 10 or maybe 12 documented cases in all of North America. Imagine that. Only a dozen in all these years." The paper was the product of his latest fascination: rare color variations in wild felines. He had always been drawn to nature and the stories hidden in the margins of research journals. Maya stood in the doorway watching him. Where Connor's curiosity took the form of quiet research and planning, Maya was full of restless energy. She loved myth and story, and the unexpected twist to a plot. "So, you're telling me there's a 1 in a million chance we'll meet a black bobcat?" she teased, stepping outside and letting the screen door creak shut behind her. Her breath puffed like smoke from a dragon's nostrils. She clapped her mittens together. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's get lost." They packed a small daybag with care. Into Connor's weathered backpack went a thermos of spiced tea, hard cheese, 2 apples, a loaf of brown bread wrapped in wax paper, a jar of honey, a bundle of dry twigs just in case, a hand-drawn map, 2 blankets, and a tiny first aid kit. Maya added her sketchbook and a pencil, wanting to capture shapes of trees and patterns of snow if they found a place sheltered from the storm. Before closing the door, she placed a note on the cabin table telling anyone where they went, though there were no other souls for miles. Her grandmother had told her long ago never to wander the woods without telling the trees your name and leaving a trail of something human behind. The trail behind their cabin was narrow and lined with white birch, the papery bark peeling in curls. Connor had studied maps and trail reports, marking with a red pencil where a trail camera had once captured a blurry shadow believed to be the elusive melanistic bobcat. The plan was simple: follow the groomed trail until the second bridge, turn left at a cluster of spruce trees shaped like a crooked hand, then walk up the ridge and down towards a frozen marsh. If the animal existed anywhere, it would be near there. They had no illusion of truly finding a black bobcat. The walk was more about being together, away from guest lists and seating charts and the drama that clung to even the simplest wedding. As they walked, their boots crunched through fresh powder, the snow squeaking. Maya reached out to brush the bottom of pine branches, sending a flurry of snowflakes onto Connor's hat. He laughed and shook them off. Underfoot, tracks told stories, delicate prints of snowshoe hairs, linear marks of voles, a set of fox prints weaving a drunken line. Maya stopped at one set of tracks and frowned. "Coyote?" she asked. Connor crouched, rubbing his glove against the print. "Could be. Or a young wolf, but likely a coyote. They sometimes follow the old trapper's trail. Don't worry, they avoid humans." An hour into their walk, the sky changed. What had been a gentle drift of snow turned horizontal. A wall of white that erased shadows and smudged the edges of trees until the world became a blurred charcoal drawing. Wind howled low like an animal calling through the trunks. They pulled their scarves tighter, bent into the wind, and kept walking. At the fork marked on the map, they hesitated. Everything looked identical under the snow. Connor checked his compass and they turned left, but the left soon turned to an unknown right. Minutes stretched into an hour. The path narrowed and then disappeared. They looked at each other and realized at the same moment that they were off the trail. Connor reached for his phone out of habit. The screen flickered at 2% battery and displayed a lone bar of signal that vanished as he watched. They stood in the silence, the wind pressing cold hands against their cheeks. The snow thickened. "We should turn back," Maya said. But which way was back? The trees offered no hint. The birches stood like rows of ghostly sentinels. Connor shook his head and scanned the tree line. "We keep calm," he said, though his voice wavered ever so slightly. "We need to find shelter or a landmark. No panic." He folded the map and placed it back in the pack. Its red lines were now meaningless under the whiteout. Through the swirling snow came a dark shape, low to the ground. For a heartbeat, Connor's rational mind cataloged possibilities. Dog, coyote, a trick of the light. It moved with feline grace, the shoulders rolling under its coat. "Probably just a house cat that wandered out," he muttered, half to reassure himself. Maya said nothing. The shape stopped and looked back at them. Ears tipped with tufts, a bobbed tail, spots faintly visible in the sheen of its dark coat. It was no house cat. It was a bobcat, and not just any bobcat. This one appeared as if the night itself had taken form. Its fur almost black, but with ghostly rosettes shimmering when the light hit at the right angle. Connor's breath caught. The words from his research paper flashed through his mind. Only a handful ever recorded. Only one documented in Canada in 1983. The impossibility of the moment broke across him like a wave. For a second, he thought the animal would disappear, vanishing like a mirage. Instead, it turned and padded through the snow, pausing after a few paces to glance over its shoulder, as if checking that they followed. Its eyes were a piercing gold, intelligent and unafraid. Something primal stirred in both of them, a trust older than reason. Without words, the couple followed. Each footfall of the bobcat packed the snow ahead into a clear path. The animal led them through a natural windbreak behind fallen logs, down a slope shielded from the gale by a ridge, across a stream frozen into jagged ice where Connor tested the surface with his weight before helping Maya over. When he slipped, his hands found Maya's shoulder, and they both laughed at the absurdity of their situation, laughter that quickly dissolved into steam in the cold air. They followed the animal not out of recklessness, but because every cell in their bodies told them that this was their best chance. The journey stretched, measured not by distance, but by slow, careful steps and by conversation that filled the spaces between their breaths. At first, they spoke of the trail, each describing details of the path they had taken in hopes of reconstructing their way back. Then, as though the blizzard stripped away layers of pretense, deeper conversations emerged. Under the weight of swirling snow and the steady rhythm of the bobcat's gait, Connor admitted his fear of change. What if we become strangers? What if marriage means losing the people we are now? He confessed, voice almost carried away by the wind. Maya's mittened hand brushed his. Change is inevitable, she said softly. My fear is pouring my heart into this wedding and then feeling alone in it. I don't want to carry our whole life on my shoulders. I don't want to always be the planner, the organizer, the one who makes us happen. Her words were raw and honest. There was no anger, only fatigue laced with hope. They spoke of family expectations, of Connor's parents still reeling from a divorce and his father's cynicism about marriage, of Maya's mother who was determined to host a perfect reception because she never had one. They spoke of finances, of the future children they both wanted but were terrified to raise in an unpredictable world. The storm and the mysterious guide created a cocoon that made it possible to speak truths they had avoided in the comfort of their normal lives. As the hours passed, cold seeped into their bones. Fingers numbed despite gloves, noses ran, and every inhalation stung. Still, the bobcat never hurried and never vanished. Its coat sometimes disappeared completely against the dark of spruce trunks, only to reappear against the white of snow. It moved with a purpose that felt deliberate, not the random path of a wandering animal. Once, it paused and lifted its head, sniffing the air, then made a sharp turn that led them away from a gully where the wind would have funneled, saving them from exposure. They began to speak to it as if it could understand. "Thank you," Maya whispered when it slowed at a steep incline. Connor found himself murmuring, "Lead on, friend," and laughing at himself. The bobcat's ears twitched. Perhaps it heard. Perhaps it was just the wind. Time lost meaning. Their hands clasped and unclasped. Connor recited childhood stories his grandfather told him about voyageurs who followed wolves to safety, adding a line here or there to amuse Maya. She shared tales of her grandmother, a Mi'kmaq woman who believed animals were messengers, that each meeting had a purpose. "Maybe this one is telling us something," Maya said. "Maybe we're supposed to listen." Their breathing synced with the bobcat's silent rhythm. Step, pause, breath. Step, pause, breath. Even fear took on a cadence. When exhaustion pressed upon them like a weight, when the edges of their vision blurred and the storm howled as if the sky were splitting open, the bobcat crested a small rise and stopped. The couple staggered after it and saw, half buried in drifts and almost invisible in the dark, a weathered structure. A cabin, low and stout, logs chinked with moss, a rusty chimney pipe protruding at a jaunty angle. The window was frosted over, but faint light glowed from within. Smoke? The possibility of warmth was intoxicating. They hurried to the door and pushed. It groaned but gave way. Inside, the air smelled of old smoke and cedar. A small pile of kindling sat in a corner near a Franklin stove. A jar of matches waited on a shelf. Someone had been here before, maybe long ago, maybe only recently. On a wooden table stood a metal crank radio covered in dust. An old wool blanket draped over a chair. They were not the first souls to need shelter here, and yet it felt like the space had been prepared just for them. Maya sobbed with relief. Connor gathered her close, forehead touching her forehead, the cold fading from his mind. He lit a match. Soon, a thin flame caught and then roared as they fed the stove. They hung their damp gloves on a stick near the heat. Maya poured the last of the tea into tin cups, and they cupped their hands around them like pilgrims at a holy site. In the flickering orange light, as the storm screamed outside and snow pelted the cabin walls, Connor whispered, "Let's not wait until Saturday." His voice cracked. "Why wait when I already choose you? I know I've been afraid, but standing out there, thinking about you and us, I realize that fear isn't a reason to delay living." Maya looked at him, her eyes shining with tears and firelight. She touched his cheek. "Then we marry now in our hearts," she replied. The words settled between them like a vow. They held each other, feeling the heat of the fire and the heat of their joined hands. Outside, the bobcat's form was barely visible through the frost-covered window. It sat on the sill, tail curled neatly around its feet, ears alert. It seemed to be standing guard. After warming themselves, they tried the crank radio. For long minutes, there was only static and random bursts of sound. Connor kept turning the handle until his arm ached. Then, a crackle, and through the noise, a voice. "Blizzard. Conditions. Missing couple near Birch Ridge," Maya shouted. Connor spoke into the small built-in microphone with the urgency of someone who could see salvation within reach. "We're here. We're at a cabin near the old Trapper's Ridge." There was no immediate reply, but knowing that someone might have heard sent a surge of hope through them. They slept in shifts, feeding the fire and listening to the wind. Dreams came of snow falling forever and of the bobcat standing atop a mountain calling to them. In the morning, when pale light seeped through the small window and the storm had eased to a quiet whisper, the sound of voices approached, distant at first, then clear. Men with bright jackets and snowshoes shouted their names. "Maya! Connor!" They were saved. When they opened the cabin door, the bobcat was gone. On the windowsill, however, pressed into the frost, were prints. 4 neat toe pads, a heel pad with a tiny notch. The prints slowly faded as the sun climbed higher. Weeks later, on what was supposed to be their original wedding day, Maya and Connor returned to that clearing with their families and a handful of friends. They had moved the ceremony to the outdoors, to this place that had become more sacred to them than any chapel. White chairs sank slightly into snowdrifts. A string quartet braved the cold under a tent, their guests bundled in blankets and hats, sipping hot cider that steamed in the chill air. Maya wore a cream-colored dress with a cloak trimmed in fur. Connor wore his grandfather's wool coat over his suit. Their vows referenced the storm and the bobcat. They promised to follow each other through darkness, to be honest as the birch trees are bare, to remember that the rarest things are not to be possessed, but to be respected. They acknowledged the gift they'd been given, the second chance and the guidance from a creature some had never even heard existed. As the officiant, Maya's grandmother, pronounced them married, a gasp rippled through the guests. At the tree line, amid the shadows of spruce, stood the same black bobcat. Its coat shimmered with rosettes in the sunlight. Its ears twitched, and its yellow eyes seemed to rest on each person. The wind stilled for a heartbeat, as if the world held its breath. Maya's heart hammered. Connor squeezed her hand. The bobcat blinked once, turned, and walked silently back into the woods. It did not look back. In the months that followed, the story of the bobcat spread among their community. People approached Connor with disbelief and wonder, some with skepticism. A neighbor insisted what they saw was just a dark house cat. An uncle declared it was a myth invented for attention. Connor showed them the research paper he had been reading that Christmas morning, quoting from it. That only one other melanistic bobcat had been recorded in Canada decades ago, and that all other recorded individuals were from Florida. He added that a trapper near Cocagne had snared one just the previous year, and that conservationists were outraged at the loss. "We saw a living rarity," he would say, "and we didn't take a photograph because we were busy following it to safety." Maybe that is better, Maya would listen quietly, then add her grandmother's view, that some stories were not for proof, but for meaning. The experience changed them. In their small New Brunswick community, they volunteered for wildlife rescue organizations. They organized fundraisers to support rehabilitation centers for injured lynx and bobcats, turning their wedding registry into a donation campaign. They used their story to advocate against snaring and indiscriminate trapping, telling crowds that if a trap had taken the life of their guide, they may not have survived. Connor returned to school to study conservation biology, focusing on genetic variation in felids. Maya started a blog called Black Bobcat Bride, sharing stories about overlooked species and the people who cared for them. She included sketches of bobcats and lynx, of cabins in storms, of couples holding hands in the snow. Their social media feed wasn't just wedding photos, it was filled with calls to action. In the spring, when the snow melted and the world turned green, they hiked back to the old trapper's cabin. The path was easier now, with the memory of the bobcat's route etched in their minds. The cabin looked smaller in the absence of snow. They cleaned it up, stacked new firewood, left canned goods in a sealed tin, and hung a laminated map with directions back to the main trail. On the back of the door, Maya wrote in black marker, "If you find yourself here, you are not alone. Follow your heart and respect the wilderness." They both traced the words with their fingers. Years later, when they told the story to their children, they did not dramatize it but let the details speak for themselves. The storm, the fear, the honest conversation, the miraculous guide. They would sit in their living room with a fire blazing, a cat curled on the hearth, and they would tell how sometimes help comes from unexpected places and how the natural world is full of mysteries we cannot own. Their daughter would ask, "Was it magic?" And Connor would say, "It was nature." Maya would add, "And maybe nature is magic." Their son would ask if the bobcat was real, and Maya would nod. Real in the most important way. In those retellings, the rarity of the animal always featured, that scientists had recorded only 12 in all of North America, that their bobcat was one of them. The children grew up with a reverence for wildlife. They learned to hike with respect, to leave no trace, to hear stories in the forest's quiet. The bobcat was never seen again. There were times when Maya swore she saw a shadow move at the edge of her vision on long winter drives, or when Connor found a set of prints in fresh snow that seemed just a shade darker than the rest. Each time they smiled and felt gratitude. The event remained a hinge on which their lives turned. It reminded them that the extraordinary hides in the ordinary, and that being saved can mean more than survival. It can mean awakening. Long after their hair had grayed and the edges of the printed research paper had softened from being handled, Long after their blog had inspired many to volunteer at wildlife rehabilitation centers and raise funds for conservation, they would hold hands on winter nights and hear in the wind the faint echo of paws padding through snow. They would know that somewhere far beyond their cabin, a dark, furred creature moved silently beneath the stars, guiding some other lost soul back to a place of light and love.